Hello, and welcome to the Digital Workspace Works podcast. I'm Ryan Purvis, your host, supported by our producer Heather Bicknell. In this series, you'll hear stories and opinions from experts in the field, stories from the front lines, the problems they face and how they solved them, the areas they focused on from technology, people and processes, to the approaches they took that will help you to get to the grips with the digital workspace inner workings. So welcome, Holly, to the Digital Workspace Works podcast. We're very grateful to have you on and giving us some of your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Do you want to give us a bit of background to yourself and tell us a bit about what you think the digital workspace is?
Yes, the background to myself is fairly easy. The way I typically introduce myself is I break into computers and buildings for a living. So a lot of what I do is what some people refer to as information security and what others refer to as ethical hacking. For me, the digital workspace really is all about collaboration. It's about how do we work well together, how do we work well electronically together. And I think that's probably been pushed to its boundaries recently with everybody working remotely and those kinds of things. I am in the office today, but our entire team isn't here. So even so, with me being physically in the office, I'm still working collaboratively with people remotely. And the digital workspace is the thing that enables us to do that.
Great. I was actually looking at your background, wondering if it was a really good fake background or if it actually was an office.
No, this is just the corner office. Yeah, there's no Zoom backgrounds here. That's why you can hear ping pong.
Oh, great. Oh, that's cool. So the background to us chatting is that I attended a mentorship training last week, and you did an hour on information security and, as you say, what you described. And I thought it'd be really good to share with everybody else. So do you want to give us a bit of a rundown on that?
Yeah, so I can tell you how that started. That's a series of mentorship programs for startups. So it's for the startup mentors. And what we're talking about is cybersecurity for small businesses, scale-ups, startups, and SMEs. And really how that was posed to me originally was like, can you do an hour on cybersecurity? So, well, yeah, but I mean, how do you crush cybersecurity down into an hour, right? So part of it is security awareness, so just covering the basics. So talking about how bad passwords are and why they suck. And a part of it is dispelling common misconceptions. So the misconceptions could be around who are hackers, or what we might refer to as threat actors, to use the industry term for it. And a part of it is around how certain attacks work. So how do hackers crack passwords? What does password cracking mean? And those kinds of things. The idea being that the mentors will hopefully, of course, become more secure in the way that they work, but also they can pass that on to the startups and the scale-ups so that as they're concentrating on growing and concentrating on building products, they can hopefully keep security in the back of their minds as they do that.
Great. Well, what have you seen now with everyone working from home with your business? I mean, are your customers now becoming more aware of the security they need to have in place that they didn't have before potentially because of having a building which they felt secure in? I use that with air quotes.
Not necessarily. There's a lot of organizations who maybe don't appreciate what the risk of remote working is. A lot of organizations treat VPNs as though they're magic, and they don't necessarily consider things like the working environment that their staff are in. They don't necessarily consider things like the devices that staff members are on. And for a lot of organizations, because they've made the move to remote work under duress, they haven't exactly had like a strategy or a plan for dealing with that. So for example, there are certain organizations who've suddenly very quickly introduced a bring your own device policy. There's some organizations who've suddenly moved to remote working who maybe didn't have a capacity for that previously. So I think it's had a big security impact, and not every organization has necessarily performed the proper change management to handle that.
Yeah, I can believe that. I mean, if I look at how we've approached it, I mean, we've always designed to work from home. Mm-hmm. So we've had those, the training's always been there. And the minute we all went remote, one of the first things to do was redid all the training. And the training's not sort of the death by PowerPoint. You sit there, we just throw it at you and you got to absorb it. It's scenario training. But in conversation with mates of mine, not everyone's done that. And it has been people working at the kitchen table with documents on the kitchen counter or the dining table that are sensitive with the family walking around. And they've had to... It's not always the family, right? Think about people who live in shared houses. That's quite common, certainly in city environments, for people to share apartments or be 3 or 4 people in the same house. So it's not necessarily even family members. It could just be housemates. Yeah, exactly. And you've got to really put an extra level of conscientiousness around what you're doing if it is sensitive. And even, sort of anecdotally, people walk around in their gardens talking on the phone, not thinking about people listening in the other gardens to what they're saying.
Yeah, I remember seeing one person saying that their company had complained to them, saying that they need to make sure that they're in a private environment before taking sensitive calls. And the guy responds like, I live in a studio apartment. What do you want me to do?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the other thing that we covered in that session was around passwords and how easy it was to guess them and break them. I don't know if you wanted to go through some of those. You're obviously not going to show the slide deck, but maybe some of the topics you covered in that were quite interesting.
Yeah, I think the big thing with passwords really is that they're fundamentally broken, and there's in many cases just a better alternative. So things like multi-factor authentication, it can be implemented so that it's not such a security inconvenience, and it can prevent a significant number of attacks, even quite sophisticated attacks. I think people think of multi-factor authentication just in the basic sense of maybe getting a 6-digit PIN number sent by text message to your mobile phone, for example. And there's lots of different ways of implementing it. You can have hardware tokens, you can have app-based 2FA with a mobile device, you can have PIN numbers. And all of these different methods have a different kind of convenience factor to them, but they're an improvement over passwords. The big thing with password cracking or guessing passwords is that a lot of people don't realize how it works, and in particular, how quickly threat actors or hackers, if you prefer, are able to guess them. Very often the hacker isn't trying to log into the interface, but what we would do is we would, through a technical attack, be able to capture a cryptographically protected copy of the password. So some people may have heard the term password hash. It's a cryptographically protected copy of the password. We get these in all kinds of different places. A really good, easy example for people to think of is wireless networks. When your device connects to your wireless network, it authenticates over the air. So if my device is within the wireless range of your wireless network, then I can take a copy of that handshake, and then I may be able to take that handshake away and perform a crack or a password guessing attack remotely. And because we're doing that remotely, we're not bumping up against things like account lockouts. Because we're doing it remotely, we can guess those passwords very, very quickly. So in the session that we did last week, I showed some of the speeds that we can achieve for certain different kinds of password cracking. And on the machine that I was using in that demonstration for wireless passwords, I was able to attempt 6.5 million password attempts a second, which is a huge number.
Are password managers sort of something that everyone should be using, in your opinion, Holly? Or what's kind of the best way for, I guess, individuals to protect themselves and then companies to, I know you mentioned MFA, or two-factor, but are those sort of the best solutions that we have currently to put some protections in place?
This is the problem with a lot of security stuff. You get down into the it depends area of security. So multi-factor authentication is great, and that's why I would lead with that. But in some instances, people might find that just systems don't support multi-factor authentication. And if that system doesn't have it implemented so you can't use it, then you need to look for an alternative. Password managers, to take them in isolation, are great at dealing with the fact that weak and reused passwords are a major insecurity, and password managers can be a nice balance between convenience and insecurity. So it allows you to pick one long, random, non-deterministic password that's then used to protect your other passwords. It can be implemented in a way that's nice and convenient. So you can use it on a mobile device, for example, and then have something like Face ID integration or Touch ID integration to make accessing the password manager nice and easy, and it just saves all of your passwords for you. Some people worry about, what if the password manager gets hacked? That's a legitimate risk, and it's something that we should consider within our threat modeling and consider within, how we handle risk. But for the average user, typically, a weak, easily guessable or reused password is a significantly bigger insecurity than a password manager would ever have. So it's the balance of impact and prevalence there. But yeah, password managers are awesome, and multi-factor authentication is awesome, and you should use both of them wherever you can. But when you look to implement them, don't just look immediately for, what is the most secure option here. Try and get a nice balance for usability and security. The reason I say that, it might sound unusual coming from a security person to say that, is if the workflow, if using that tool is so inconvenient, if it's so much duress for you to use that solution, using a password manager, using multi-factor authentication is awesome, but it has to still enable you to work and to do your job.
Yeah, so as I say, we use LastPass, and that's exactly why we use it. It's got a very nice. I mean, it's not the best interface, and to your point around the friction of using these things, I find LastPass a bit painful to use sometimes to share credentials, but it is pretty secure, and it is one of those that if someone were to hack into them, and I think they were hit once upon a time, they actually protect your materials quite well in that it's encrypted on the device.
Yeah, LastPass has had a few security vulnerabilities, but one of the things I like about them in particular is they're very forthcoming with it. So the information about the security vulnerability is just on their website. So they had a breach, I think it was back in 2015, and all of the information's on there just in terms of like, this is what happened, this is how we responded, this is what the vulnerability was and how we mitigated it. That's a nice thing to see. You know, like it's better than an organization sweeping that under the carpet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's almost your trust being built as opposed to being brought down by them being hacked, so that they do the right things when they get dealt a blow, so to speak. I had a question for you around sort of no passwords. When I was with one of the banks, we were looking at actually moving completely away from passwords using biometrics and that sort of thing. What are your thoughts on that?
So passwords have security issues, and if you can effectively replace them with something else, single factor authentication where the factor is not a password but a device that you have access to, that can make the job of the hacker more difficult. If there's no password to guess but it's some other system. But the problem of authentication, the problem of passwords is much bigger than that. So if an organization is looking at how do we get rid of passwords entirely and go to a no password solution, some of the things to still consider are things like, okay, if we're authenticating with a device, what happens if a member of staff loses their device? How do they gain access in that case? Are there risks around, the help desk, the IT help desk being able to grant people access, those kinds of things? So, passwords suck, and I would generally recommend anywhere that we can minimize the impact that a weak password would have. But authentication is somewhat of a bigger problem.
No, definitely. With people working remotely and that, do you think there's a need for almost a corporation to have a policy that houses have to meet a certain level of security standard? So one of the things would be, how do you enforce that? I'm generally against policies that you can't enforce, and I would generally be against any policy that might disadvantage somebody. So if you have a company requirement that, staff must have to be in an isolated environment when taking calls and those kinds of things, people who have house shares who may be somewhat disadvantaged, wouldn't be able to work there. So there's a balance to be had there, just in terms of like the diversity side of things and making sure that people from less privileged backgrounds aren't disadvantaged by that. I think there's other ways of handling that problem than enforcing things through policy. And then also generically, anytime a company enforces something through a policy, they should have some way of making sure that's the case. To give you a good example there, it's really, really common to see companies put things in their password policies like, passwords must not be based on a dictionary word or something like that, and then have no technical enforcement to actually prevent you choosing, password 123 or something. So policy and implementation should line up. Yeah, definitely. I mean, we talked a bit about bringing your own device and then that being a way for people to work from home.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's not a trend at some point to bring your own app where you start providing the same through a custom mobile app or something like that you can almost sandbox the functionality and the security through that.
Yeah, bring your own device is often implemented in that way. So there's a lot of mobile device management solutions, MDMs, where that effectively is an app that's installed on the user's device so that their personal profile, their work profile is separate. And also the work profile can have whatever policy enforcement the company wants. If you want a certain password length, or if the company wants something like the ability to remotely erase the device, the staff member won't be upset about the fact that the company can remotely delete all of the data, because they're only deleting the data from within that containerized environment. So that's the thing that's been around for a while, and it's definitely something that I would recommend organizations look at if they're looking at BYOD, bring your own device, as opposed to the kind of approach of just like, use your phone for work things if you want to. There should be some plan there to enable the protection of data, but also ensuring that the company can check if something's gone wrong, if data's leaked, and if it has, then having functions like the ability to erase devices.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. I mean, data leak protection is such a difficult thing to monitor and action on. unless you start really owning the entire ecosystem. And having worked with a lot of VDI infrastructures, that typically is the business case, is that you're controlling the whole environment and the user's really just connecting via a thin client into a data center. To secure that data, which works, but it's expensive. It's a very expensive solution. Not everyone can do that.
I mean, it's expensive in some regards, but less so in others. So if you have a virtual desktop environment where people can just connect into a standardized environment, whilst that might be expensive to set up, or it might be expensive from a licensing point of view, it can be better in other ways. So it can have lower administrative overheads because all of the machines are standardized. It can be faster to set up. If you have a new member of staff join the company, it can be faster to get them up and running. So I think organizations should consider more than just things like licensing costs and look at, how does this make us more efficient as a business?
No, you're 100% right. When I say expensive, it's that hurdle to begin with. Can you spend the amount of money you need to spend? I think with what's coming out of Microsoft now with WVD, I think there's an AWS compete to that as well. It does make that barrier a little bit lower, so that other organizations that don't have the big budgets can get on board.
Yeah, there's some solutions in that regard where you're paying effectively per user as well, which is a bit more flexible for organizations as they scale. Because, of course, anytime you implement something, if you're trying to scale up, you need to make sure that it's good for the company today, but also good for what the company is going to look like in 3 months or 6 months' time.
Definitely. What are your thoughts on sort of post-COVID? What do you think there's a post-COVID? Do you think this is going to be forever, or would you see a future where, and what would that future look like from a security point of view?
I've seen a lot of different things from a lot of different organizations, all of which have a security impact. So some organizations are talking about spending some time in the office and some time not, so maybe 2 days a week. Those can have security implications in terms of social engineering and physical access risks. So if there is a less standardized approach to where people are working, those kinds of things, it can just be harder to maintain a secure profile, and making sure that people know what to do in the event of people accessing the office who maybe shouldn't be there, who should be accessing the office, those kinds of things. I've also seen some organizations say that they're going to move away from like a headquarters office model where everybody goes to the same building and instead have satellite offices. That can have a risk in terms of, well, there's more geographic areas to secure. So everything affects security in a different way. And I think one of the things to do at that point, like whatever you're planning, is do threat modeling. So threat modeling is just taking a look through, how does this impact security, and then how do you mitigate those risks? If you've got a lot of small offices distributed across the country, one of the risks might be, well, what if somebody accesses one of those networks and plugs a device into an unattended network port or something like that? Well, we have protections in place. We have things that can mitigate those risks. So network access control, for example. But of course, the company needs to take a look at what are those risks, come up with a plan, and then implement the solution before kind of doing things under duress.
Yeah, you can't rush it. That's for sure. And it almost feels like you need to have a checklist that you can provide. You'd also have a generic checklist, and then you'd have a checklist that would be specific to, are you using shared office space? Because I think there's a lot of companies using shared office space, at least for satellite offices, while having an HQ. Located. Yeah. What
does a satellite office look like as well? I think a lot of companies are considering these things from maybe a cost perspective, saving money on the real estate, and that's fine. But would a satellite office maybe be a co-location space? That would be cool, but of course that brings along different security risks as well.
Yeah, we worked for a long time, and besides being very noisy, rather loud, from the point of view that you could see through everyone's glass walls. There's just information everywhere, which not everyone took the time to have, privacy screens or hide their, wipe their whiteboards down. I mean, you could have walked around and find out, what the business did just looking through their walls.
Yeah, I mean, there's that stuff, but there's also things like how is the internet connection provided? If you're in a co-location environment, is it a shared internet connection? And then if it is, how do you make sure that your connection to the internet or your connection to cloud resources is secure? It's, again, a fairly easy thing typically. Virtual private network would enable a secure connection, but it takes some thought to make sure those things are in place.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess I wanted to maybe shift gears just a little bit. And Holly, for some background, something that we talk a lot about on this podcast is actually something you had mentioned a little bit earlier, which is just kind of like a lot of trade-offs that get made in both information security and IT between, different factors like security and usability or functionality, and sort of balancing this whole, these different forces to make something that will work, best for your employees while still protecting the organization. I don't know if you have any thoughts or opinions on sort of the relationship between IT and information security and sort of what the best model is there.
Yeah, so I'll give you a good example of where you might get some tension between IT and security would be applying security updates to services. So some IT people might be concerned around things like, if we install an update, will it disrupt a system? Will that system need to reboot? Those kinds of things. Whereas the security team might be really concerned around the fact of, if a security update isn't applied, would we be vulnerable? And of course, there's a balance to be had there. What the balance might be in that instance is, well, what is the security update? Because whilst in security awareness training, we might say something really generic and really broad, like you should install all security updates as soon as possible. Not every security update is the same level. You see this, for example, with Microsoft. So when Microsoft releases security updates, they grade them. So you have critical, important, optional updates. So critical updates are typically major security vulnerabilities, possibly in some instances vulnerabilities where there's a publicly known exploit for that vulnerability, and those should go in as soon as possible. Whereas the optional ones, they're a less concern. So organizations, everybody who stumbles into this problem of security versus IT, and they need to come up with a plan for dealing with that. One of the plans for dealing with that, depending on company scale and budgets, could just be having a test environment. If you can roll that security update out to a test environment and see if it causes disruption, then that might give you more confidence to make that change. Or alternatively, there could be some policy around, okay, critical updates go in as soon as possible and important or optional updates go in to some other schedule. But it's a thing that an organization should definitely take a look at, because it's a very, very common problem.
The thing that we talk about with one of our other guests is that the security by design step is often missed. So security by design is at the end. Is you've built a solution, you need to come back to apply some policy or some regulation, and you realize that your solution actually hasn't been designed in a way that makes it easy. So you end up with a very complicated, frustrating experience for someone who has to use it. Things like multi-factor doesn't work, so they build their own way of doing the factor authentication with an email, for example, using magic links, which is different to, say, using an authenticator app with the randomized 6 digits. So that's what I was thinking about as you were speaking, is that sort of murky place that you can get stuck in.
Yeah, a lot of people think of security as well as just always an inconvenience, but it isn't always the case. I think a good example of that would be password managers. Password managers can increase the convenience because they're handling passwords for you. So instead of having the kind of usability, accessibility issue of trying to have unique, long, random passwords for every site, it's effectively password escrow, so it's handling that for you. And I mentioned earlier using password managers on a mobile device, and then leveraging features like Face ID or features like Touch ID, so that you're getting the benefit of security without it being an inconvenience. The counterpoint always is, of course, so if security isn't well implemented, or if it isn't implemented at all in the system that you're trying to use, you can't get that benefit, and you maybe have to find it elsewhere. And then we end up with non-standardized approaches and all kinds of problems.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because in a way you look at how commercial, and the analogy here is, for me, is F1 racing versus the average car. So most new technology for a motor vehicle is tested out, specifically around safety and speed, in the racing arenas, and then it filters back via the manufacturers into the sort of day-to-day cars. And it used to be the same thing in the consumer world for technology, is that most things were driven by big organizations with big budgets, pushing the limits to deliver or meet some regulation. But that's almost been flipped around now, because the average consumer has gained, because of the likes of Apple and Samsung, etc., driving their mobile devices, this better experience where, for example, you mentioned this header that you don't know how to use a password manager, but if you look at the Apple operating system, there's a password manager built in, and it's been there for ages. But I remember working for an organization where we kept putting it on the list, and it kept moving further and further down the list because it just felt like a complicated thing to bring in. Meanwhile, it would take away some complication.
Yeah, I think one of the problems there as well is if companies don't enable staff members to do these kinds of things, if you don't enable staff to use password managers, what you'll find in some instances is they are using them. They're just using them in a non-standardized approach. So maybe they've got the password manager on their home phone instead of their work device, those kinds of things. It can be really frustrating. And you do see this sometimes with websites as well. If the website isn't compatible with password managers, it's just pushing people towards insecure practices or at least non-standard practices.
Yeah, and also putting things in browsers, storing it in your browser password cache, which I've never been a fan of for a number of reasons. And one of those is, you've got to trust the company that built the browser to be worried about it, not just putting some functionality in that looks cool.
There's that as well, but there's also with any of these solutions that we've talked about today, it's like, what happens when it goes wrong? So, I've just advocated for having a password manager on your mobile device. What happens if you lose your phone? And again, there's the solutions for all of those problems, right? But it's like, okay, I've stored all of my passwords in my browser and then, dropped my laptop in a puddle and it's broken. Now I can't log into anything. Yeah. Or, my mobile phone is the screen's cracked and I can't see any of the tokens. I can't log into anything. There's solutions there, but again, it's a thing to think through as an organization, as opposed to finding yourself where your IT manager's dropped his phone and that's it. Now everybody's locked out of the company.
Yeah, and it's the same with when you talk about that password list technology, having a YubiKey, for example. If you lose a YubiKey, which is a physical key to log you in with, how do you get another one? And what do you do in the time it takes to get the second one from when you lost the first one to actually be able to work?
Yeah, and that problem gets somewhat worse as well if you have non-technical staff and you're trying to help those staff members have more secure practices. They just might not know what the best thing is to do there. So there needs to be some awareness training to go alongside that within the company, not generic awareness training around like, hey, passwords suck, you should use something else. But this is what you do in these instances. This is what you do if you break your phone. This is what you do if your laptop's inaccessible.
Have you seen? From a children's point of view, any education that's been worthwhile, or do you think that's a gap that needs to be filled?
I think one of the problems with security that might be relevant when we talk about children is oversimplifying security. A lot of young people are pretty tech savvy these days. They've grown up with a lot of devices, and the usability thing isn't necessarily a problem. But if we try and oversimplify these things or dumbing it down so that we can talk to them about security, we miss some of the details that can be important. So I very often see in security awareness training a conflation between connecting to a website where the connection is secure, so talking about HTTPS websites, and then connecting to a website where the website can be trusted, so that's in the context of phishing. And just because your connection is secure to the website doesn't mean the website can be trusted, but they often get conflated. So you see people saying things like, oh, when you're receiving an unexpected email, make sure that the link is a HTTPS link, or make sure you have the padlock in your browser. Those kinds of things, they're not relevant within that context. Having a secure connection to a hacker's website isn't going to give you the protection that you think it is. So oversimplifying things can sometimes cause problems, and definitely the difference between a secure connection and a trustworthy website is one that I see sometimes conflated.
Yeah, I just wonder if there's not a level of educating at a young age, things like being aware of protecting your data. So you mentioned the HTTPS.
Yeah.
Maybe less technical, but at least being aware to look at those things. Or most kids will grow up today with email and social media accounts. And how do you approach that? How do you behave on those sort of things?
Well, you can approach these things in a non-technical way. We've just had a quite long conversation around cybersecurity and passwords and those kinds of things. But we haven't got into the details around entropy and all of the kind of cryptographic fundamentals, because you don't necessarily need to have somebody who's informed about the risks. So, just because a person might be non-technical or might just be young, you can still explain to them what those risks are without getting kind of knee deep in technical detail.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is a horses for courses approach.
Yeah.
I mean, I've used this example before, but I watch sort of the kids around us and how they're on devices all the time and not really worrying too much about what they're doing on those devices or what the information they're sharing. And a lot of that's pushed on the parents to know and to teach them. Most of the parents don't know what's good and bad.
Yeah, that is true. In terms of whose responsibility is it? I think a lot of people might just fall back to the parents should do it, but if they don't know themselves, then there needs to be some resources, and there are resources out there. So within the UK, for example, we have the National Cybersecurity Centre, who puts a lot of resources out there. A lot of theirs are focused around business, but trying to simplify things for people so that they understand, the different categories of risk and those kinds of things. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to fall onto the parents. There can just be, resources perhaps put forward by the government and things like that.
I mean, if someone wanted to get into cyber, being this is your area of expertise, where would you point them to start off with from an education point of view, or getting their hands dirty?
Entirely depends on who you are. And I think this is one of the things with cybersecurity where you'll hear people say things like, oh, you don't need a degree. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't get one. It doesn't mean that doesn't work for you. I think that the best part about cyber is there's a lot of different approaches in. If you wanted to go to university and get a degree, then you could get an ethical hacking degree, or like myself, I have a master's in information security, so it's a little bit more generic. That is a path in. Alternatively, you could go for a technical apprenticeship. You could just do hands-on. You can do the hobbyist approach. There's a lot of different ways in. I think that the first step for somebody who's kind of interested in security and doesn't know where to start is, realize that security is a huge field and try and get some overview knowledge. Try and work out what parts interest you. So what I do is the breaking side of security, right? It's the penetration testing, as we call it within the industry. You might like security, but not like the breaking department. You might want to work on the defensive team. So you might want to work on the analysts team. So those kinds of things. So I think the place to start is just, realize it's a huge industry and take a little look around at what the different jobs are. And then when you find out the job that works for you, then look at how can you get those skills. And the emphasis there is on you, what works for you. So there's academic approaches, there's hands-on learning, there's things like, for the security side that I do, there's things like vulnerable virtual machines. There's a lot of different ways in which you can pick this up. And I don't think you should ever be kind of shoehorned into an approach that doesn't work for you.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I've got a friend who's trying to move into it now. And I've sort of said the same thing. You need to go and look at what you need to understand the ecosystem, because it is big, as you say. And then he's got a fixation on one of the courses to do. And it's a good course to do in the sense that it's an essentials course.
Yeah.
But then it is about finding a network, finding people that are doing it right now and sort of getting the day job view of what it is.
Yeah, and it's completely fine to change your mind as well. You might start making moves towards a secure development role or something like that, and then realize breaking department's more interesting and make a move. Because all of that knowledge, all of the fundamental IT knowledge, all of the security knowledge is going to be useful. Yeah,
and I think there's a level of also being, because it's quite a young industry in a lot of ways, the more diverse your background is, the better. There's a lot of technical people in the field, but actually coming from, say, marketing or a business field and coming in from that angle might be more beneficial in some respects.
Yeah, absolutely. Or even within IT. So, for example, we recruit from sysadmin backgrounds where people have a good networking understanding. We recruit from software development backgrounds where they have a good, building applications knowledge. Or we recruit, graduates in from ethical hacking degrees straight into penetration testing roles. So there's a lot of different ways to sidestep within the industry, within broader IT, but also within cybersecurity.
So I guess on this vein, are there I'd be curious to know, since we're sort of on the career conversation, Holly, sort of what are your favorite parts of the job? Like, why did you decide to specialize in the braking side? And then also, like, are there any sort of skills or qualities that you think really set people up for success in that kind of a role?
Even within the braking department, within penetration testing, there's a huge variety of roles. So no matter what kind of person you are, you'd probably find something here that is interesting to you. So I'll give you two good examples of that. When it comes to things like exploit development, that's really hands-on, knee-deep technical stuff. You're probably going to spend a lot of time staring at a command line. Whereas on the other side of this same job role, there's things like social engineering, which is a lot of face-to-face interactions, a lot of communicating. That could be preparing and sending phishing emails, or it might be physical access into buildings. It could be coercing people over the phone. So we've got everything from kind of independent working on highly technical things right up to social engineering. So in terms of qualities, I think the big thing is just don't discount yourself. If you see a certain stereotype within this industry, don't think that you don't match that. There could still be a role for you. And you are absolutely right that there's a big place for people of diverse backgrounds. And the big thing there would just be, well, take a look at the roles, find the parts of the roles that you like the most, and then no doubt there'll be an organization out there that works well for you.
Yeah, that's great advice. I know we're sort of running up a little bit on time here, so I wanted to shift a little bit to the future conversation, if that works for you all. But actually what I've been thinking about this, and I was actually scrolling LinkedIn because there was a post that I wanted to kind of pose to both of you because it caught my eye the other week. And it was from Citrix. They ran a poll that said, according to their research, by 2035, implanted tech could make employees exceptional at their jobs or doom them to burnout. Would you ask employees to go under the knife? And until I'm going to wait to reveal what the yes/no split was on this, but I'd love to hear what both of you think about if that's like an eventuality, like that we do implant a tech on employees, or if that's just kind of like a no-go, like sci-fi experiment.
I absolutely don't, under any circumstances, think my employer or my government should have any control over my body. Mm-hmm. So there you go. That's a really direct and really blunt answer, but no, absolutely not for me.
Well, I think where we are now, I wouldn't trust them. Mm-hmm. And if you just look at the amount of conspiracy theories that are floating around because of this virus and this pandemic, and they call it a scamdemic, etc., I don't think anyone in good conscience will allow the government to do that. But I think, a couple of generations from now, it might become normal.
Okay, I guess it's a good time for me to reveal what the split was on the poll. So it was 88% no, which is, it's high, but what really struck me was the 12% yes, that there'd be over, 10% of the around 400 people who answered this poll who could see that happening in the future. So just thought it was interesting.
Well, I think it comes down to trust. And I don't think many people trust their governments, at the moment. So you probably get a very high no. But if things are going well and there's a clear benefit to doing it, then you probably would see more yeses. So I could that result.
The counter argument is which government. So one of the difficulties you have at the moment, of course, is if you take an electronic device through an airport, then you can pass through several jurisdictions on a journey. And which government you might infinitely trust your own government, and then you might travel on holiday or for work to another country where the laws or the regulations are slightly different, and that could cause you an issue.
Yeah. I mean, I guess personally, I'd be much more keen to do some sort of, either like a, some sort of just Face ID or fingerprint scanner or whatever to be passwordless. Like that very much appeals to me. But I'm struggling to see any other strong application. I mean, I see some security applications, I guess, for the implanted tech, but I think there are other ways you could do it without, an implant.
Yeah, I mean, bringing a bit of science fiction. So there's a couple of book series that I've read where we're having where Elon Musk is going with his brain thing, having something right the brain to allow you to be instantly connected and download data and all that kind of stuff. I can definitely see value in that.
There's an interesting link here into the US legal side of things in terms of the Fifth Amendment. So I'm not a lawyer, but it's an interesting thing to look into for those who are interested in terms of compelled speech under the Fifth Amendment. So it's my understanding that US law enforcement can't force you to disclose a password, but can force you to unlock a mobile device that's protected by biometrics. So if you have an iPhone that's protected with Touch ID, they can compel you to unlock that. But if it's protected with a PIN code, they currently can't. So there's those regulations as well. So when you think of things like implants, how that plays into compelled speech is important.
I mean, this is a...
Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, I mean, this is a big thing, even with all the protests and everything that's been happening in the US and travel and anything else. When Face ID came out from Apple, it was a big conversation around, like, you know, if you're going to a protest or if you're going to, you know, do something, turn off your Face ID and switch to a different code or something like that, so that you can't, your phone can't be cracked. Yeah,
there's a thing that you can actually disable the biometrics on iPhones without unlocking them. So that's again a security awareness thing. And if you're passing through an airport, if you're passing through certain jurisdictions, and you need to turn those things off, or I guess more directly for some people, maybe, you know, if you're being pulled over by the police, you can disable those things without unlocking the devices. And, you know, for some instances, those kinds of things are important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say, I remember, I don't know if this is still operating, but I think in Hong Kong airport, when you walk through, they're doing some sort of facial recognition. This has been going on for years to speed up passport processing. I don't know if it's still running, but there was a thing for a while.
Yeah, a lot of airports have biometrics for those who have biometric passports. But again, the concern isn't necessarily the technology; it's how it's used and who controls it in that way. You know, Face ID is a wonderful thing that increases convenience, and in certain instances is great. But to be able to have warrantless searches is not great. So again, it falls into that problem of securities. Well, it depends.
Yeah, and actually that example you mentioned, the facial recognition, I remember there was a case in the US where a lady they were trying to get her to open her phone, and she refused to open it, give the password, and then because of facial recognition, they were able to open the phone by pointing it at her.
Yes. Yeah, so that's a Fifth Amendment issue within the US. That's the law that fits under, is my understanding. But that's how that works. As an interesting detail for those who are concerned by that, Apple therefore introduced a feature where you can disable the biometrics just from the phone. Depends on the version of the phone, but power button and the volume button together will disable that. So if you ever are in that situation, then you can protect yourself. And I think this gets into that difficult kind of policy area where some people would say, well, the police should be able to do, you know, law enforcement should be able to do investigations and those kinds of things. And yeah, I agree. That's why warrants exist.
I need to go and figure that out for my phone, because I think that's a useful feature. Great. I think we're out of time. So do you want to maybe just tell everyone where they can find you on social media?
Twitter.com/Holly Graceful.
Super. And LinkedIn as well would be?
It's the same one. It's Holly Graceful.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for all your time today. It's been great chatting.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it. So, Heather, anything from you to tie up?
No, I really appreciate the conversation, Holly. It was really interesting, and thanks for diving into it with us.
No problem. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Heather Bicknell is our producer and editor. Thank you, Heather, for your hard work on this episode. Please subscribe to the series and rate us on iTunes or the Google Play Store. Follow us on Twitter @the DWW Podcast. The show notes and transcripts will be available on the website www.digitalworkspace.works. Please also visit our website www.digitalworkspace.works and subscribe to our newsletter. And lastly, if you found this episode useful, please share with your friends or colleagues.